Hi there, my name is Philip Idson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the podcast, I'm going to share with you a recent conversation from an AOP live webinar that focused on public procurement and how public organizations can successfully make the case for prioritizing supplier diversity as a core strategy. I'm joined by Sean Correll, head of iValua's public sector, and Jarrod McAdoo, the senior product marketing manager at iValua. And Sean and Jarrod both answer mine and some audience questions based around three themes. First is making public sector supplier diversity discovery, onboarding, and management easier through some fit-for-purpose digital procurement technologies. Secondly, the need for effective contract administration in response to new and changing regulations and legislation. And third, the advantage associated with making specific diversity spend commitments to incentivize municipalities and agencies to work with new suppliers and therefore drive innovation. So with that being said, let's jump straight into the webinar as we begin the conversation. Okay, so today's topic, we know from a procurement perspective that a diverse supply base is more competitive, it helps us unlock innovation faster, provides access to new markets, and it helps deliver localized socioeconomic impact. But a lot of times we have difficulty in actually making that business case for diversity or really implementing it into our sourcing processes. I think especially so in the public sector. And so today's guests, we have two guests that are going to help us connect the dots and turn diversity into a true win-win opportunity, both for procurement and for the suppliers that we source. So our guests today are Sean Correll. Sean is head of iValua's public sector team, and Jarrod McAdoo, senior product marketing manager at iValua. Okay, so that's all the intros. I'm actually going to start off with my first question. I'm going to ask it to you, Sean, and that's just for context. I wonder if you could share a little bit about how did you end up specializing in public sector procurement?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I really cut my teeth as a young naval officer. Spent about 8.5 years in the Navy and had several jobs in supply chain, and that's kind of what started. That was the spark, right? Mm-hmm. And then worked supply chain and procurement all throughout my time at Accenture, and involved in public sector as well as financial clients, and then moved over to a small firm which became a larger firm called Taurus, where I actually worked several years with Kelly Varner. So it's great to be here with her again. And again, a lot of state clients, a lot of federal clients were the focus. And when I moved over to iValua, that's when it really clicked, and I specialized in the public sector from there on out.
It's funny, you mentioned working with Kelly in the past. It's such a small world as this procurement community. So many times these relationships cross paths many years after they have the first time that we met. Jarrod, same question for you. How did you end up specializing in public sector procurement?
Yeah, it's a little bit like Sean's, but not quite. He spent a lot of time as a Navy officer. I actually worked as a prime contractor for the Navy through the first part of my career. A job I deeply love, so I spent a lot of time doing that. And then I also moved over to commercial nuclear, which has a government component. And then later on, I transitioned into higher education procurement with a research university. So being part of public procurement sort of always been in my blood from the day I got out of college. So it's just always been there, and something I really like to gravitate to.
Well, we have topics today, and first of all, thank you, Sean and Jarrod, for your introductions. We have a couple of topics that we want to go through related to diversity and public sector procurement. I want to start, Sean, just by asking you what types of agencies or municipalities are you actually working with, and what are you seeing kind of the current recovery status, if you will, from the pandemic?
Sure. Well, we cover what I would say is the gamut across the public sector. Certainly, state and local, state agencies, as well as entire state procurement divisions. The federal side as well. Higher ed that Jarrod talked to a little bit earlier, and then lastly the nonprofit. And I think in terms of recovery, it really depends. I think there's still a lot of pressure on because of the lack of revenues over the last year and a half across the public sector. Although, in terms of verticals, they've done better than many. For instance, the transportation sector was absolutely devastated. So the public sector's done better than some and not as well as others. Perhaps high tech has probably done actually well during the pandemic. So we see them still being a little bit cautious with their timelines and new investments, but they're still there. They still have the need for transformation. They still have the need for digitization. So the initiatives are still there. They're coming back. They're just they're a little bit slower, I think, and I think that's being driven a little bit by the downturn in revenues over the last year and a half on the state and local side.
Have you seen a difference in the role of procurement over the last 18 months or 2 years with those organizations that you support? Or is it very much, on a case-by-case basis? When you think about the role, the impact, the strategic nature that procurement can play?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it seems like a cyclical thing in terms of when procurement sort of carries more weight in the boardroom and in an organization. You really saw that back in the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, where it was all about savings and cutting back. And I think this time around with COVID, again, the cycles come back where procurement's been front and center, again, mainly because of the ability to digitize your operations and gain more efficiencies and less of the paper.
Right. Removing some of those historical roadblocks that sometimes lead to a negative perception of procurement is so important to helping us get into more things and getting ahead in terms of buying decisions and the strategic planning and those kind of things. And that's something that you're seeing.
Absolutely.
So I want to talk, as we set this out, as being about supplier diversity. And I'm going to ask you this again, Sean. This is a question that came in from Sandy. Sandy asked, what's a good starting point for a public sector supplier diversity program? And how can procurement ensure evaluation criteria used in qualifications-based awards do not have unintended negative consequences on smaller or newer businesses? I think maybe there's a couple of parts to that question. So start off by, what's a good starting point for a supplier diversity program in public sector?
Yeah, so again, I think you'll see those that are very mature in this and those that aren't, but it really depends on what that public sector entity is trying to accomplish. Or, we talked at the very beginning how diversity brings innovation, it brings creativity, it really drives us forward. So you start with what is it you're trying to accomplish, and then I think you can get to the more harder objective pieces of it. For instance, when you do solicitations, if you are serious about increasing your diversity, then put that criteria in your evaluations, and don't just, if you have ambitions, you can talk about it, or you can affect it by putting it into your scores. For instance, maybe if you're trying to get more local or more small businesses, then give them a higher score based on the fact that they're a small business or a minority business.
So you can look at it from a weighting perspective as you're doing the evaluation based on those criteria.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Phil, I'd echo what Sean said on that as well, because I think he's spot on. But one thing, when I'm talking to people as well, is a good piece of starting information is understand what your baseline is. Too often, when you start out with a diversity program, you think maybe you have more or less diverse suppliers in your existing supplier base than you do. So, a lot of times we want to jump to setting goals. But knowing what that baseline is so you can set an achievable goal, will help your credibility and help your program right from the start as well. And then feeds right into what Sean mentioned on that.
As you're thinking about your baseline, what are some of the ways that you see public sector organizations think about that, and actually start to grab the data so they can do the analysis?
Yeah, the first couple, ways to think about it is to really decide, and this can be a mix, sometimes it's more driven down exactly what it needs to be as far as, here's how I'm going to classify diverse suppliers. Start asking yourself questions is, do I need to have a certification to be considered a diverse supplier in my supply base? Am I going to allow them to self-certify?
Yeah.
So answering those type of questions and what categories you're looking for, and then how do I enrich my data or just review my data? I don't need to make it sound more exotic than it needs to be, but do I trust the data I have on these? Or do I need to take some efforts on those? So, I see a lot of people answering those questions is, what types of diversity and certifications do I require? Am I also going to build in stuff like localization components as well? Because I think considering those outside of a diversity, can lead to problems down the line. And then how do I enrich my data? What's the source of truth? Do I need help from a third party? Can I use a lot of the available resources from a lot of the associations out there to validate it? And how do I go about doing those type of things? So sometimes it's a different answer for everyone, depending on the number of suppliers you have, because it can get unwieldy to do it at scale. But those are the general thought processes.
Yeah. Do you see any commonalities between organizations where they're thinking from a certification perspective, self-certify versus needing some specific certification groups, or is that driven by regulatory requirements, for example?
Yeah, sometimes it can be driven by policy requirements, just how people want to approach it. Some of the more mature organizations, they might even be split on that as well, saying, hey, look, I don't have the time to go through this. I want this to be effective, so I want a WeBank certification, or I want an NMSDC certification to come through. But then you have other agencies as well who are like, hey, I'll take a self-certification, and then I'll work with that supplier to help them through the hurdles of getting a certification. So they're also looking at the development part of that. As part of a larger ESG program. It's not just about getting the spend. It's really about doing what's right for the community in the company. So you sort of see a mix there, but it really depends on where you're at with the maturity, resources, what policies you may have to find. So I think it's run the gambit a little bit.
Do you recommend that you set up at it from a programmatic? You approach supply diversity from a programmatic level, so it's not necessarily just changing your sourcing procedures, for example, to from a weighting perspective, to say you're going to give more weight as you're looking at responses to diverse suppliers, but kind of taking a level higher than that and saying, okay, this is going to be important to us, and therefore we're going to do something that's a lot more structured, if you will.
Yeah, I think if in my experience, and I'll only speak from my experience because I'm sure there's some people out in the crowd who probably may have done it better. When I've tried to tackle this, and I've tried to tackle it just from the sourcing perspective, the success wasn't what I needed it to be.
Mm-hmm.
When we started looking at it holistically, when I started saying, all right, before I think about sourcing, I'm going to think about how am I going to engage? What am I going to do internally, look at the way I run myself and the way I might bring on new suppliers, because I can't expect everyone to compete with an incumbent on, I've developed a lot of those requirements over 15 years of working with them. How do I examine those? So I think if you start looking at it programmatically, how am I going to use the data? What metrics am I going to report out on just beyond the spend type metrics? What am I going to do to outreach, enablement, training, feedback, level set? I think when you start looking at those, and then you feed down into the sourcing, you have a bigger chance of meeting your goals or achieving the kind of impact you want to, on this, outside of just meeting your regulatory requirements, that is a must for a lot of those revenue generating activities.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, when you talk about programmatically, one of the things that you always hear about new suppliers trying to break into business is lowering those barriers to entry, right? So, you're talking about taking it a step up. How do you make sure that you can do that and get the diversity you want in your supplier base? It's a delicate balance, but it's something every supplier will tell you. It is breaking into a new industry or breaking into a new customer. Those barriers that are there with the incumbents, they're tough to overcome. So it's a tough balancing act.
Yeah, for sure.
That actually segues nicely into a question we did have from Arden. And Jarrod, I'm going to ask this to you first of all, which is around from your perspective, what are some of the most impactful, effective ways to introduce internal stakeholders to a diverse and potentially new pool of suppliers? Because oftentimes, like Sean just said, then you kind of stick with the familiar. And so there may be hesitancy internally, even if you've identified qualified suppliers, to want to make that switch.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I mean you can even take that beyond diversity when you're doing any type of supplier switch, because with internal stakeholders, especially with operational aspects, I mean it's a personal. Their suppliers, their service, it gets to be a personal level. Where I've had the biggest lessons learned is you try to sort of pierce that is, all right, a lot of times stakeholders feel like this is being done to me, not being done with me. And there's always sort of a desire, you want to lead with the metric saying, hey, I'm looking to have 10% small business spend and we're at 3%. Well, that's probably too high a level there. So you start looking at maybe some of the other metrics. And I mean, you guys mentioned in a lead, there's so many other benefits now for supplier diversity with resiliency, innovation. Even if you don't have the metric information yet, start talking about the stakeholders about, here's how I'm going to report it out to you. Here's the metrics beyond the organization spend, is what innovations did I drive for you? How am I going to demonstrate risk reduction or resiliency to you? And then say, get their buy-in to those metrics, and so they're part of it. So then they can see as that grows as well. And then just also giving them a chance to interact with the suppliers and coach them. Chances are an incumbent knows how the stakeholder wants things done, because they've had that chance to get that coaching. Let the stakeholder, if they're willing, and most of them are, is to give that coaching to the new set of suppliers. But yeah, it's sometimes you probably heard it in the non-public sector side, but I'm from corporate, I'm here to help.
Yeah.
They don't want to hear that. They want to hear is, hey, how can we drive this value together, for this? And that still has its challenges, easier said than done. But I think it's more of an effective way.
Do you feel that it's purely a procurement responsibility to be opening the hearts and the minds of the stakeholder population to new suppliers who may also be diverse, or whether it requires some kind of partnership with the executives to be driving that from driving it top down, so that we're there as part of the solution, but not necessarily the one that's fully advocating for taking a different perspective in bringing on board diverse suppliers.
Yeah, I think you would do procurement a disservice if they were in charge of this. It really does need that leadership. It needs that vision, because again, it's to hear an executive echo on why this is good for the organization. With all those ancillary benefits to that, and to be able to tie yourself to those type of things is extremely important. Procurement's really good about driving things. We saw that in the pandemic; they really respond. But to give them the right tools in their chest, there you need to have that executive support.
And I do just want to encourage anybody, if you've got any questions as we're going through this conversation, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A section of GoToWebinar. I'm going to come over to Kelly in a moment or two just to see if we've had any questions come in so far. But I do just want to come back to you, Sean, have a question about, we talked a little bit about that top-down, I guess, mandate, if you will. I wonder if access to state federal funding, if that actually affects the diversity supply and movement in the public sector. So there are other factors beyond kind of procurement control that can drive the importance of supply diversity within your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at those sort of those, you want to call them macro trends or macro activities that go out there, just look at the American Rescue Plan. That had budget earmarked for small businesses. It also had contingencies for minority businesses, and that starts at the federal level and it trickles down into the states and the municipalities. So it absolutely has an effect, and it's to be seen whether the infrastructure bill will have something similar.
Right.
But and you've got procurement organizations and government entities that are already planning on, it hasn't been passed yet, but they're already planning on how they're going to use that
Right.
infrastructure money, right? They've been planning for over a year now.
They're just waiting for the moment that
Right.
kind of for the go, if you will.
Right.
Kelly, I'm going to come over to you to see if we've got any questions from today's audience yet to pose to Sean or to Jarrod.
We do have some questions that have come in. So for this first one, Sean, let me start with you. We have a question around how procurement's market analysis work should affect supplier diversity, right? So we were talking a little bit about some of the programmatic challenges where we try to handle something like diversity the same in every category or in every sourcing project, but the concentration of diverse suppliers is not the same by product, by service, by area. Are there additional steps that procurement needs to do to understand first if there is an opportunity to bring in some diverse suppliers for a specific product and how big that opportunity is based on the availability and concentration of those suppliers?
Sure. So this is something that evangelists in this industry and this vertical have been talking about for well over 20 years, right? Phil and Kelly, yourself included. And it's about getting visibility into your spending habits, right? We've been talking about this since well before 2000. So to your point, Kelly, there are categories of spend where it may not be realistic to set the same goals for small businesses, for instance. Take some of the events that we did together, right? Take less than truckload hauling versus full truckload hauling. Less than truckload hauling, those are big companies that are able to do that. There's not very many mom and pops that can do that. But for truckload, you've got the mom and pops that own one truck and one computer that can do that, right? So I think back to your point, you've got to take a look at those and set realistic goals based on your categories. And it all comes back to what we've been talking about for years and years. And that's understanding how you're spending your money and understanding your categories.
Jarrod, anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think you sort of hit it there, and it's sort of inevitable when you look at your category spend, what you consider low-hanging fruit from a savings perspective, and what you also really consider low-hanging fruit as you're doing in ESG or diversity is, there's going to be all of those categories that are more commodities, and you're going to be able to move faster, and you're going to be able to get something accomplished. And it's not always about just making the metrics, but getting something accomplished lets you learn from the process too. So before you go tackle a category that's a little more qualified, a little harder to change out, it's a really good way to pressure test some of your new thoughts and processes for onboarding new suppliers and how you get things done. So I really think you as you look for these is, hey, where is our opportunity to do these things quickly? Where can I get local? Where can I get diverse? Where do we have a concentration? And then spread out from there. And you'll inevitably find some categories where, like anything else, you won't have the concentration. So then you can turn to, is there any developing? Is there anything that I can keep my eye on for that? You can switch to more of the intelligence on it. But I think a SMART program looks for those low-hanging fruits, just like you would for a savings program.
Yeah, no, that's great. And Jarrod, I'm actually going to stay with you for this next question because I think we have Carol with us today who has, I think, asked the $1 million question, which is, whether it's public sector or private sector, there is a huge push behind diversifying the supply base. And a lot of times that also means bringing in smaller suppliers. And as she says, one of the biggest challenges with this is that if you're a large agency or municipality or a large company, the same thing applies on the private side, your business requirements are often not met by these suppliers. And the big one, of course, is insurance. What are some of the ways that you have seen organizations overcome the fact that the suppliers they want to include as part of these diversity programs don't meet some of the other requirements that are very standardized for other suppliers?
Yeah, that's a difficult question because but it's an important question to ask, and it'll change by the size that organization you are. Can you absorb that? There is a risk, with doing this. There's a high upside on this, but be able to look at some of those sacred cows where you weren't willing to take the risk in the past in order to turn that over. I think each organization needs to look at the service, the commodity they're providing. A lot of these requirements, and at least in my life, is you develop in some insurance requirements, and it gets pushed down to use a procurement professional, and you apply it across everything. And then you really have to ask yourself the hard question, and a lot of times go back to legal and risk to say, does this really need to apply to this category? What is the risk to the organization that we really have with this? So again, looking for those opportunities to do that. And you have to be smart where you can waive those. Obviously, you don't want to waive some insurance on somebody who's maybe coming on site to cut down trees, on some of those. But, some other areas, you really have some opportunities to really say, hey, is it one size fits all? Where can I give a little bit on those, which I think Sean alluded to earlier. It's, a lot of this is really in Phil mentioned the barriers to entry is, sometimes we just have to take a hard look at ourselves on what we've built. And, it's been around a long time and it's worked, but is it really necessary? Is a little bit of risk worth some payoff on this? So that's where, I've seen some people is really starting to take a look at that and, where can I bend? Where can I be flexible? On these type of items, and and it helps when you got a good process down and you can qualify suppliers and you understand where those risks are and you're capturing it. Sort of feeds into that as well. But
well, and I don't know if this is fair. Let me sort of throw this out as maybe an assumption and see if it matches what you guys have seen in practice, is that there might be a correlation between how many small and or diversity owned suppliers you currently have in your supply base and how many of these obstacles or barriers to entry you're likely to hit, like an insurance requirement, or like the level of paperwork, or like the number of portals or databases that suppliers have to register in. Is it fair? And I'll start with you, Jarrod, and then I'll come to you, Sean, for your thoughts. Is it fair to say that there's sort of a loose correlation between how many of these sort of exception-based companies you've worked with in the past, and how long it's going to take you to actually make some progress towards the goals and objectives you've set for yourself?
I think it's probably a little more than a loose connection there. I mean, you can really, and when you really look at it, is we've built up a lot of requirements over the years, for a lot of the incumbents, which end up being big organizations with a bigger back office or an administrative staff. And you just don't have that. It's like it's almost like hazing to get into the fraternity sometimes. If you can survive all the requirements and the forms, you can get in on some of these. And so it is a turnoff. It's if they wanted to work with me in the public sector versus working with somebody else in the private sector, and they would say, well, I would need to hire 2 people just to compete, let alone win, where in the private sector, maybe I'm better off putting the resources there. So, it just can be a challenge on this. So you might even miss the opportunity for them to apply, let alone if they just can't comply because they don't understand, they don't have that. And it's nobody's fault. And I'm not saying it's bad. It's again that, I think we have to really step back and look at the way we're doing things, like the what and the how, on these. Should you really expect a small business to be able to submit 12 pounds of paper in order to get registered and qualified? Have we really taken a look? And I think it's a great time to do it because we mentioned the pandemic. A lot of things had to be loosened and waived a little bit because we needed to get stuff done. So it's a great time to reflect back on the things that we didn't do to say, did they really add any value? So it's a good time to reorganize that, you know, on that front. But yeah, I think it's completely fair. Either they can't compete because they don't have the resources to do it, or they just might want to engage with another sector that's not as hard, frankly, in order to get the business from, because they can only compete on so many things with their budget. So.
Absolutely. Sean, is there anything that you wanted to add there? And then I actually have one more set of questions that have come in from the audience.
Yeah, just to kind of dovetail onto Jarrod's last point, you know, small businesses, he talks about budget, they've got a much shorter runway to be able to respond to opportunities, right? You've got to show results early or you don't survive, right? The larger companies, they have more reserves, right? They have more ability to take on those longer term opportunities that may or may not pan out. And you know, we alluded a little bit to, hey, there's been a digital divide for decades out there. You know, those companies with better technology, better access to technology, let's face it, they are at an advantage. You know, the first person that had you know, well, not the first person, but the first 1,000 people that had cell phones in New York City, you know, had a huge advantage over those that didn't. First person maybe didn't have an advantage because he didn't have anybody to talk to. But you know, and you've also got what Jarrod talked about was this regulatory divide. In the federal government, if you're not familiar with how to work with FARs and DFARs, you're at a huge disadvantage. And there are companies that have been doing business with the federal government for 5, 10, 15, 30 years that have got it down pat. They have lawyers that know how to get through the FARs and the DFARs. Small businesses don't have that experience. So you've got this sort of regulatory divide. Now, to the federal government's credit, they also have some programs out there for what they call pilots and for R&D that entice new suppliers not to have to go through those regulatory requirements, but it is limited. At least there's a mechanism there, but you know, I'd say for the full-on opportunities in the federal government, you've got to understand FARs and DFARs and be able to navigate through them.
And that's actually a perfect transition to this next set of questions. Helen and Justin are actually asking questions in kind of the same area around, you know, the core of our topic today, which is making the case for diversity in the public sector. And if you're at step one and you're trying to get this started, you know, two parts to this question. Is this the type of initiative where procurement is best suited, running sort of a pilot and making a small, isolated, lower risk case that it can work, and then using that to sell the value proposition and the opportunity in other larger, more high visibility or more complex categories? And second piece to the question, are there any categories of spend where you have seen the public sector sort of start their supplier diversity program and use it as the foundation to build success? So first part of that, does the pilot model make sense? Second part of it, are there any categories or products or specific services that you have seen be more successful around building that business case?
Do you want to start, Jarrod, or you want me?
I was just going to throw it on you to start first.
Okay, yeah, no, I can start. So, you know, first question, absolutely, the pilot approach is one. It goes back to allowing those smaller, especially smaller businesses, to use their runway more efficiently. You know, they don't have the runway to do a year-long procurement process that may or may not pan out after a year. Whereas pilots or proof of concepts, you don't have to spend as many resources to get the same amount of success. And once you show that success, you've given yourself more runway. So I would say yes to that, the first part of that question. The second part of that question, you know, what categories have I seen breakthroughs? Well, I'm a little prejudiced, but certainly in the technology category, I've seen what I think are the ability for smaller suppliers to break through. I do, and again, I would say, unless somebody educates me differently, It feels like it's easier to do that at the state and local level than it is at the federal level. And maybe some of that is driven by the state and local level looking for suppliers that are in their domain, whereas the federal government is, they're looking for, you got a much bigger pool of suppliers there. So yeah, I would say technology is one where I've seen smaller and more diverse suppliers have more success breaking in.
Jarrod, is there anything that you wanted to add to that before I hand the floor back to Phil to continue the conversation?
Yeah, I'll echo what Sean said. I think another good category to look to is, items like, facility type work. It lends itself very well because you're looking at a local supplier that the stakeholders will interact a lot with. So, a lot of that type of service work, it's service level driven, and the greater the touch and the interaction with those individuals, the greater the service level ends up being, and you really you can drive a lot of improvement and innovation because you're working with them so closely. So I'm not against the bigger national contracts, especially if you had to do a janitorial, but looking at opportunities where I've looked at it, where we've had it in areas, is where's an opportunity for this facility to be able to work with a local, small, or diverse business to get that service level. And if I'm paying a little bit of a premium because I haven't bid it all out together, is it worth it? And you can see those type of things because you can see the service levels. So I would agree with Sean, definitely on the technology, but I think a lot of the service-based ones where you can work closely with it are good opportunities.
Thank you, Kelly, and lots of great questions. I see that it looks like there's some more coming in, so I know I'll be back to you before the end. It's making my job easy, all the questions coming in today. I do have a couple that I wanted to pose, and I'm going to start with you, Jarrod, from a question that we got from Darren in advance of the webinar, which was, how can we have diversity but still maintain transparency and fairness in public procurement? Yeah, it sounds like that's coming from a perspective of not going the pendulum swinging. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that one.
Yeah, it's it's sometimes when you're talking about set asides aside, that's I set aside, all right, let's put aside set aside requirements, but looking at driving diversity, it almost feels like, is it really fair? And fairness in a matter of, in a lot of public procurement, is just about being transparent. I think the best way you can do it is to have a good open acquisition policy out there. So you're letting every bidder know, if they're dealing with you, this is the type of consideration we would give to a smaller diverse, whether it's a 1 or 2% under $150,000, or a 3% or 1% over $250,000 that we might give on some of these considerations, or how it's weighted and scored. That's what it's really about, on this, is making sure everybody understands the rules of the game that they're playing on there. It's diversity is a thoughtful process and program to make sure you're awarding it. It's not arbitrary.
Yeah.
And just making sure that you're communicating that out in a good, published, transparent acquisition policy, that, at least in my experience, and be interested in hearing what anyone else thinks as well, is goes a long way, so people know, on this.
Yeah, folks know the rules of engagement before they start, which is actually something that can be leveled at procurement, whether it's public or private sector. And there's often said about it being a black box. And when we talked a little bit about small businesses and the investment that small businesses need to make to participate in processes like this can be really expensive. So knowing kind of how things are going to be run and how they're managed and what their chances are, ultimately, I think helps them make decisions of whether it's something they want to engage with as well.
Agreed.
I have another question that I think is best directed, at least to start, Jarrod, to you, and of course, Sean, you can feel free to jump in to any of these questions as well. This came from Enad before the webinar as well. How can we balance supplier consolidation and rationalization with supplier diversity? Because we're often under pressure to reduce supply bases, but on the other side, when we're looking at supply diversity, that's all about bringing new folks in. So, can you have one without the other? Or, how do you balance that internally?
Oh boy, yeah, this is a tough question. This is where when I talk to some of my friends out in procurement, I have a different sort of view on supplier rationalization these days, and they tell me, hey, you're out of touch on these. But in the old days, not too long ago, and still a lot today, it's rationalization is a good value lever. It's how do I spread my limited resources and get more out of these? I deal with less suppliers. I increase my negotiation power. I increase my ability to manage more effectively those suppliers to do those things. I don't have to manage as much information. So it was a good value lever. I sort of take a different approach nowadays, and I'll set aside some of the more complex and qualified categories that if they're direct manufacturing or if it's really a qualified component or services, the need to rationalize the supply base. And I'm not talking about cleaning up suppliers that you just don't do business with. That's a good business project. But relying on rationalization as a value lever sometimes is a symptom of just a bad process.
Right.
I think that you can choose in a lot of categories to bring in more suppliers, because we have reached the point with organizations and tools out there that we can discover suppliers more quickly, we can onboard them digitally, we can execute things digitally. It's not the old grind it used to be, and managing the information isn't the grind it used to be. So we can handle that a lot more efficiently. So we should really look for opportunities where we're continuing to, I can bring a supplier in, I can onboard them, I can execute, I can manage them, and if need to, I can offboard them very quickly because I have the tools in place and the systems in place to do that now. That's available. So the rationalization before, I don't think it's quite the same. And again, there's certain categories you would set it aside, but if I have indirects or commodity categories where I really want to bid this and have greater inclusion every time I do it and give new diverse suppliers a chance or other suppliers a chance, I can do that because I can discover them quickly, I can onboard them, I can qualify with them, I can execute those items as well. So it's somewhat of a mindset change. And again, it's not for everyone right now because you need to have some of those items in place, but I definitely think it's possible. And I think thinking about rationalization differently is probably a good idea as well. And it's a lot about introspection on a lot of these things, as you've probably seen my my thought process going through here.
That's a really good point, Jarrod. The one you made about rationalization. It really, you hear supplier rationalization, it evokes cost cutting and it evokes thoughts of supplier cutting. But your point was, supplier rationalization doesn't have to mean reducing the number of suppliers, especially given what's gone on over the last 18 months in terms of figuring out that in a lot of cases, companies, organizations have to reduce risk. And by reducing risk, they're increasing the number of suppliers. That's another way to rationalize your supplier base. I mean, it's not just about cutting. So really good point. And, it's a continuous process, the rationalization, but the diversity also needs to be that continuous process, right? So you got the ability to not just cut your supplier base, but de-risk your supplier base by adding suppliers and taking diversity into consideration as you go through that continual rationalization process.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we don't confuse bad supplier data with supplier rationalization. I've been in an organization where I had Granger in my vendor master 55 different times because it got loaded some different way. So I might have told my boss, hey, I'm going to rationalize the supplier base, but what I really meant is I'm going to clean up the junk data. So there's, one's a thoughtful process. The other one is just, a tactical process you really need to do to trust your data. Sometimes they get lumped together, and, it's just good to have that visibility.
Yes, it's interesting. Supply-based rationalization from a procurement perspective, as you both said, was kind of the tool of leverage, and it's very much a cost-based tactic or expense management tactic. I think of organizations that I've been in where the demand has come from a CFO, and it's been around, I don't know where my suppliers are, there's risk in my systems, all the things that you talked about from an efficiency perspective. It costs me this much to process, to onboard, to offboard. And with a lot of that now being moot because of technology, actually, from when it comes to a risk perspective, it's riskier to have a small supply base than it is to have a bigger supply base. As we're seeing now with you need optionality. And if you've got a small supply base, you can't have that. You're not able to move quickly. You're not able to react to events. So I do feel it's kind of, the pendulum is going in the other direction in terms of larger versus smaller supply bases.
I agree. Totally agree.
Now, you talked a little bit about the ability to discover, the ability to onboard suppliers being a lot different today than it was 5-10 years ago even. And obviously technology plays a really key role in that. And I'm going to ask Sean for you to start, what role do you see technology, because you see this on a day-to-day basis as folks are digitalizing and maturing their processes as a result. What role can technology play on the procurement side to actually help better involve small and diverse owned businesses?
I think it goes back to a couple of what I would call procurement drivers. One being efficiency, right? It's a whole heck of a lot easier with technology to onboard a brand new supplier today than it was 20 years ago without technology, or even in the public sector, just 4 years ago. We still had, or 3 years ago, it's kind of scary. We still had some government entities out there that did all of their onboarding with paper, and not an easy process. And you can do it so much faster and so much more efficiently now. And then two, I would say, we've talked about this. Another, what I would call procurement driver, is transparency and auditability. When you've got it in digitally, you've got it. You can go back and see exactly what happened and when it happened. You're not looking through file cabinets. Right. You're not looking through somebody's email. So I would say that's, those are the two ways, that come to my mind first in terms of how technology can enable this.
Yeah, and I'll sort of feed on what Sean said earlier. Is small and diverse suppliers, they don't have the runway to spend a lot of times doing this. And I always like talking to one of our customers, City of New York, and when they talk about when they digitized their process, they took a supplier registration process that took months, many months, and they shrunk it down to a matter of days and a couple weeks. So you can imagine that, what a small business, what that means to them is the 12 pounds of paper aside. That's another good one they share, that it took 12 pounds of paper to get qualified, but to save 4 or 5 months to get on a qualified supplier and start looking for business, that makes all the difference. It's a quarter is very important on the financial sheet to them. So it's just gets them out there. It moves it forward along with everything else Sean said as well.
That shows the importance of considering the supplier experience as a procurement professional, because I don't think that's, and I can only speak personally, when I think about, when I was on the practitioner side, I didn't necessarily think about that so much, or as much as I should, because you're thinking about it in terms of maybe that traditional procurement mindset of, I've got some money to spend, and I'm going to ask them to jump through all these hoops to go, because at the end of the day, they're going to get some money for it. Now, that's a very old world type of thinking, but it shows how important it is. We talk a lot about, being the customer of choice. And these kind of thinking about the supplier experience helps drive those relationships, so that these providers, especially the small, diverse, the innovative suppliers, want to work with you rather than and invest scarce resources that they do have with you versus somebody else, because you're making it easy for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kelly, I'm going to come back to you to see if we've got any more questions that have come in from the audience.
We do have some questions that have come in, and in fact, probably at this point, more questions than we can get to. So I'm going to pick two of them. The first question is from Kimberly, and she's asking about the legal requirements associated with stating a preference or some type of carve out associated with diverse owned suppliers. Starting with you, Jarrod, what sorts of legal or regulatory considerations does procurement need to be aware of once you get past sort of the program and planning stage around diversity and actually get into a specific project where you're going to try to incorporate that as one of the award factors?
Yeah, I won't, It's a good question, and I won't pretend I'm a legal authority on everything. You know, I will point out that it's always good to consider where your funding source is. You know, as Sean mentioned, there's a number of different funding sources you can get from federal government, you know, down to local, or how things get passed through agencies that may have specific requirements for this. For these type of items, and even consideration. You know, I think back to just recently perusing again the you know, Buy America executive order that the latest administration issued, and there's some real language in there on, you know, smaller businesses. Hey, here's the type of consideration a domestic business should get beyond a non-domestic business, and then beyond that, a diverse business. So you really need to look at, you know, those requirements in those. There might be specific language in a prime contract that comes down, you know, for those, but it'll give you some guidance on what is the right thing to do and meet those requirements. And Kimberly, I hate to give you a non-specific answer. It's been a while since I've climbed through a lot of the regs and looked at that, but you know, it is different, and it helps to understand where the money comes from, so you understand what your opportunities are for doing that beyond, you know, having your own acquisition policy, you know, to state those things. That is something you could probably control for the majority of them. So probably not the best answer. I apologize, but I didn't want to give you a bad one.
No, I don't think you need to apologize for that answer. It's a complicated thing, right? And it's different because the public sector is not one thing. There's all different types of agencies and groups and organizations. But that also means that there's a lot of opportunity. So I think of the list of questions that I'm looking at, and I'll throw this out. You guys can race. You don't have to give us specifics, but there's some interest in hearing whether or not you can think of a story of a project that involved the public sector and diverse suppliers that was a win for both sides. So again, you don't have to tell us specifically the supplier, the agency, but can you think of a really good example just to kind of give our attendees today and those that are then listening on demand when we re-release as a podcast, what's sort of the goal that they're working towards? What does good or what does successful look like?
Yeah, I can give this a start. I'm thinking of I guess a case in Southern California. I won't go into specifics on the county or the city, but you know, again, they had a sort of a diverse supplier initiative. And again, I'm a little prejudiced. This story involves technology. So not only were they able to pick up a technology vendor that was a minority small business, but that technology vendor, their mission was to connect government organizations with minority businesses that wanted to do business with government organizations, right? And you know, this company, I want to say, has been in existence for probably 5 years, but you know, it's almost like it's easy to say killing two birds with one stone, but it's like, you know, killing a bird with a stone and then killing a giant with another, because what you're doing is you're bringing together this technology vendor, who is a minority supplier, is bringing together all of those minority suppliers that are trying to connect to the government in this particular Southern California county to do business. And you know, it was easily, you know, it's easy to say it was a win, and a big win for that county and for all those suppliers involved, including the enabler, including the technology enabler.
Yeah, I'll give an example. I'll go back maybe 20 years, and you know, I was not for this when I was part of it. Is, you know, I worked in the public sector, and we were looking for a technical writing firm to handle, you know, technical manuals, you know, for components, and it was a really critical service for us. We got pushed to use a company that was Native American owned because it was one of the categories where we were definitely falling short in. I was not for it. I wanted to use a larger organization that had more chops in my mind, because I thought it was critical, and there was a push to we should really give consideration for this, and we should really invest in developing this. And for my money, I was completely wrong. We invested in this organization. They moved close to us. They invested in us for this. We brought them along, and their service level was immaculate. That, you know, not only did they exceed service level expectations, but they redefined them for us. Is if we saw we needed something in 3 days, it was a hurry, they would say, I can get it done in 1. You know, on this. So I thought it was a real win-win, and they were extremely cost competitive because we had to re-justify that at some point. So you know, it's those things, especially, and again, we got to work with them a lot. Going back to what I said on the services, this is what sort of shaped some of my thinking. Is, you know, is a real win-win, increase the service level for the military that we were working with on turnaround on technical changes and manuals, so they can, you know, carry out their duties on this, and we're able to invest in a diverse category that, you know, frankly deserves some attention, and we were struggling in. So it's I thought it was a, you know, a real good item, and of course at the end of it I said it was all my idea, even though I was against it at the beginning. So.
Well, Kelly, thank you for jumping in with some more questions. I know that there are a number of others that we're just not going to get time to go through today, and we've only got a couple of minutes left. And I actually wanted to ask a follow-up, Jarrod, to what you were talking about there, and it's about supplier development. So do you see that as being something that procurement is responsible for, or can take a proactive responsibility for in helping develop diverse suppliers and small businesses so that they are actually ready and able to you know, to disrupt our incumbents to come on board, and that we can play a big role in that?
Yeah, I think it's something worthwhile. You know, I don't think it's just a procurement item, but I think procurement can drive it. You know, I hate to throw another thing on procurement's desk. You know, as I mentioned to you, is the suppliers that are out there, if given a chance, they will perform. And this isn't my opinion saying it. I could probably quote to you offline several research pieces of paper that just shows it pays off, not just in cost, but service. So it really pays off to be able to do that and set that up and really enable and coach and make sure people are trained the right way. You know, just keep in mind, an incumbent supplier has had the benefit of that same training. You may not think that you gave them training, but they've been interacting for 5, 10, 15, sometimes longer on these. So they've got to not only shape the policy, but understand how you work. So it's not an uneven playing field. Is you want to evaluate the supplier on the merits of their service or their product, not their ability to get through your administration. Right. So if you can level that playing field, then you've really done yourself a service, because you're showing it apples to apples, and the data shows that, you know, diverse suppliers will shine in service and in innovation, and you'll be very happy. You know, for this, there's always a stakeholder that says, this one time we tried this, it didn't work out. They always remember the bad things, but, you know, the data's there. People have been doing this for a long time. It pays off. It's worth the investment.
Sean, I just want to open up, because it's almost a great place to finish, but I want to give Sean the last word. You know, if there's anything that you want to build on from what Jarrod said, or any other perspectives that you may have in terms of helping develop some of these small and diverse suppliers.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of interesting. It was always about sourcing, or in the government world, solicitations and spend analysis and contracts and procure to pay. Sort of the last flower to bloom there was what I would call supplier management, right? That's sort of been the laggard from a lot of perspectives, from an organizational perspective, from a technology perspective. Now you've kind of seen, you know, you've seen procurement take on a bigger role in the organization over the last 20, 25 years. You're also seeing inside of procurement, and not always inside of procurement. Sometimes supplier management programs aren't run in procurement, but you're seeing them take a much bigger role than they did just 3 or 4 years ago, right? It's a great thing to see, and it feels like we're finally catching up with what's important.
No, it also brings, going right to the beginning when we're talking about the greater role that procurement can play. Supplier diversity is one of those key, and then you go above supplier diversity and look at ESG. one of those levers that we can really play a proactive role in to demonstrate value to our agency or to our organization that goes far beyond kind of the traditional remit of procurement. With that being said, I want to thank everybody for joining us today in today's AOP Live session and for all the questions that we got both in advance, and we got a ton of questions throughout the day as well. So thank you so much for those and for your engagement throughout the session. Sean, Jarrod, as well, I want to thank you very much for joining and sharing the wealth of your experience with our community. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.